Just some context for you. Both Rich and I are clinical psychologists. As he said, our bread and butter really is about developing a psychological understanding of problems such as psychosis and developing and testing better talking treatments for people with psychosis. So that's where we spend our time. So we work in the NHS and in universities. However, a perk of our job is that we do get to travel to nice countries. So we often meet over the last 10, 12 years in bars in various countries across the world talking about psychosis, psychology and life. So I blame you all for what's happened in my life over the last 10 to 12 years. Okay, it's great to be here in Teddy Hall, and there we are, somewhere there, I think. But I want to start by taking us away from here, even away from the green fields of Oxford, even further than this country and India. I want to start off by taking us about 98 million miles away. This is a picture from the Hubble telescope of where you've just gone. Anyone know where this is? It's Mars, okay. The pressure on the surface of Mars is about 0.6% of the pressure on Earth. The crust of Mars relative to the crust of Earth is 3 times greater. It's got a very thin atmosphere and it's losing it. If you travel about 120 million miles away from Mars, you end up here, which is Venus. Now, you can't see the surface of Venus because there's clouds of sulfuric acid swirling around it. This is the hottest planet in the solar system. Average temperature is about 460 degrees centigrade. The pressure on Venus is 92 times that of the pressure on Earth. Now, as many of you are probably aware, it's been suggested that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. That we're chalk and cheese, that women have the remarkable talent of understanding people, but men have the even more important talent of understanding maps. There's even going to be a Hollywood movie of Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. It's extraordinarily popular, it's sold millions, and I'm very jealous of at least the sales. And there's been academic arguments saying, yes, there are inherent biological differences between men and women that can be seen in behaviours, and then I think a very, very good book arguing the fact you can't detect these sorts of differences. There are biological differences, but you can't detect it in behaviour. So there's a lot of discussion about the differences between men and women. However, I think conspicuous by its absence any discussion of mental health in these discussions, and mental health really matters. Among working adults, half of all ill health is mental ill health. For the individuals and their carers, the pain and distress is real. And let's use the smoking analogy here, but the mental illness is tied up with physical health as well, and it has effects on life expectancy. So perhaps all these books are missing the most important differences between the genders, perhaps. So, do men and women differ in their overrides of psychological disorder? Is one gender suffering more in the current environment than the others? The options, I suppose, are that women have more, the rate's the same, men have more. So let's do a straw poll in the room. Who thinks women have more? Fair few have gone for that. Who thinks the rate's the same? Fewer people. Who think men have more? Quite a few people have gone for that. Okay, but the top one is the most common. Did a survey of Oxford general public. 2/3 thought the rates are the same. 26% women have more and 9% men have more. So a little bit different in this room. Interestingly, both men and women equally rated that the rates are the same. But if you if you thought that women had more, then you're more likely to be a woman. If you thought men have more, you might be a man. If you thought your gender suffers more. So what is the answer? I came to this about 7 years ago writing a self-help book, an 80-cent guide to mental health problems, taking disorders one at a time, talking about what the problem was, how common, what to do about it, one by one. And repeatedly finding myself writing for the problem that women had greater rates than men. So depression, rates of panic disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorders, sexual problems, sleep problems, all were much higher in women than men. Not completely a one-way street, so alcohol and drug problems are more common in men than women. But it dawned on me, basically, that, well, perhaps if women are having much more of the most common problems, then aren't they suffering more overall? surely that might add up to a difference. So I thought, well, that's incredibly interesting. I don't know anything about this. I'll go and find what the answer is in the academic journals, which I guess people don't go to these days. They just look online. But I used to love just going down to the shelves in the dust, looking at the journals. Anyway, there was no answer there at all. Looked at books, including things like this. Not a single mention of differences in overall rates of mental health in men and women. The only thing I could find actually was on the web, and that was the WHO saying that overall rates of psychiatric disorder are almost identical for men and women. So I was kind of puzzled. I thought, well, if you add it up, sure, there probably is a difference, but either people aren't talking about it or they're saying the rates are the same. The only people talking about a difference in mental health between the genders was a feminist literature, using titles of books that obviously avoided. And they were basically saying it's self-evident. So this is a quote: "Madness is a female malady because it's experienced by more women than men. But how should we interpret this statistical fact?" But there was no statistical fact. So this isn't my topic. So I had to then reluctantly, in my spare time, in the mornings, evenings, and weekends, actually go and try and find out what I thought the answer was. So this is written up in the Stress Sex with my brother, who's a writer, so he made it especially accessible to people. And very much looked at the scientific evidence, trying to answer two questions. Are there differences in overall rates between men and women? And if there are, why? This is where my love went for several years. But it's intriguing because then you obviously have to answer some fundamental questions. For example, what is mental illness? This is the chemists of the periodic table, developed in the mid-19th century, a beautiful sort of ordered list by increasing protons of the basic elements of the world. Universe, world, I don't know. Universe? Universe. Psychologists, psychiatrists, what we have is this. It's called the DSM. It's a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. And strangely, this wasn't developed upon basic properties of mental health conditions. It was developed by committee. Many committees. So here's an illustration of the numbers of people involved in the committees for the DSM. That's science and psychology and psychiatry there. And actually the first DSM was developed about 100 years after the periodic table. There's now onto its 5th edition, which is receiving a lot of scrutiny thanks to people like Richard. Most people are still on what are called DSM-4. So here's a quiz question, and you can win a copy of the Stress Sex. So commit yourself to a number. The question is, how many different diagnoses of mental illness do you think there are in DSM? 250, okay.
1,300.
1,300?
1,500.
1,500?
180.
180?
200. 700. 750.
376.
I'm D, what? 280. Okay. Give a start. The answer is 297. So I think you actually win. So congratulations. But actually life is a bit simpler than that. There's basically about 15 categories. I'm not going to go into this very much, but the most common problems are sleep problems, anxiety, mood disorders, and alcohol and drug problems, substance-related problems. Here's an example of a typical criteria for a problem such as depression. This one, it has 3 main elements really. Firstly, you've got to score a number of symptoms. So there's a list of 9 different depression symptoms such as depressed mood, weight loss, suicidal thoughts, negative thinking, those sort of things. You've got to have a number of those. You've also got to have it for a period of time, at least a fortnight in this instance, and it's also got to cause what's called clinically significant distress or impairment in your social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. This is a typical sort of setup for a diagnosis that's used in health services by psychiatrists and psychologists. So this is the first way we looked at it, by using the standard diagnostic approach. And the second issue is, well, how do you determine rates? Well, what you need to do is look at nationally represented epidemiological studies. So we know there are biases about who seeks help, so it's not that, it's about knocking on random doors across the country and interviewing people is in essence how they do it. And we looked at studies that looked over the past year, it's more reliable, And studies assessed at least anxiety and depression and alcohol and drug problems, because these are the most gender-specific disorders. These sorts of studies are few in number because they're expensive and a lot of work. We identified a dozen, mainly in Europe, America, and Australasia. So there's only from certain countries. There's lots of studies we don't have this level of data. The surveys assess many more than those four disorders I assessed, but importantly to note that none of them assess sleep problems or sexual disorders. These are highly common problems and with greater rates in women than men, but none of the studies even included that. So we've got a skew right off. What did we find? Was it men who had more? Was it women who had more? Was it equal? We did a drum roll at this point. And, oh, brilliant. Brilliant. And the answer is, it was women. In 8 of the 12 surveys, women had significantly greater rates of disorder than men. But quantity is everything, its quality is even more important. The best study, of course, is the German study. This is the most comprehensive psychiatric survey there's been, and the rates of psychiatric problems in the past year for men were 25%, so that's incredibly high. It's really high. Men have many problems too, as I'm sure you know. But the rates in women were 37%, 50% more. This is astonishing. This is the best study that could answer the question. And in the other surveys, I won't go into this, but I do want to point out that men have very high rates too, but there's variability between 10 and 40% differences in rates between men and women in these studies. It's extraordinary, really. Let's skip this for time. But there is a pattern that women have higher rates of what we call internalising disorders, taking problems out on themselves. Men always have higher rates of what we call externalising problems, taking problems out via the environment. That's very clear in every survey, so there's a pattern within this. And actually psychosis rates are pretty equal. But diagnostic symptoms are riddled with problems. Richard Benton has done marvellous work in showing the problems, really the scientific validity of many diagnoses such as schizophrenia. They seem rather arbitrary criteria, and basically the science behind them isn't very good. Despite the number of people on committees. Another way of looking at this is perhaps just to count up the sorts of problems, the number of problems. Don't actually use thresholds. You could use questionnaires such as this for depression, there's ones for alcohol. But even if you look at various data sets that just take symptom counts, you still find overall differences in rates between men and women. It's not just the diagnostic criteria that's screwing things. Skewing things, perhaps, would be a better way of putting it. Another way of looking at it is well-being, looking at whether the psychological well-being of the genders are equivalent, and they're not. Women are less happy than men. Now, an obvious thing could be that, well, men simply aren't talking about it, which obviously there's some validity in that. This is a picture of Pink Floyd, and this is an interview. Reminds me of this issue. This interview at the time around their fame. The journalist said, "Are there some difficult moments?" To which Dave Gilmour said, "Yes." The journalist says, "How do you get around them?" And the reply was, "We pretend they're not there. We certainly don't face up to them in an adult way if that's what you mean." So perhaps we're just seeing underreporting by men. There's not been a lot of study of this. Equally, there's not been a lot of study whether women are underreporting alcohol and drug problems, for example. But there's one neat study that got a group of men and women to report their level of fears of various things. Is that a mouse? Mouse, rat? One of the two. Rodents. And roller coaster rides, all those sorts of things. Got men and women to fill them out, and the women scored much higher than the men. And they brought them in a week later and said, right, this time you're going to fill in the fear survey, but you're going to watch videos of these feared objects, and we're going to hook you up and measure your physiology. We'll know whether you're fearful of these objects. And one gender changed their reporting of their fears, which was, of course, the men. The women's scores were sensibly reliable, the men's scores went up. So there was underreporting by the men. However, there were still significant differences between the genders. Women were still reporting more anxiety than men. I think there's an element of underreporting, but it probably doesn't explain it all. And there may be different reasons why we expect differences between the genders, which I'll quickly come on to some of what may account for the differences. Picking a bit more on depression, more evidence, and then on alcohol problems. So one that affects women more, one that affects men more. I'm going to look at different levels of explanation, from genetic to the brain-based, to psychological to social. Very quickly, for depression on genes, the heritability, which is one of Richard's favourite statistics, is about 40% for the heritability of depression, which means across the population, the differences in levels of depression down to genes are perhaps around 40%. Is it different between men and women? It's unclear. There's some evidence saying it is different, and some evidence suggesting that there is greater heritability in women. It's not known for sure whether there is a heritable difference between men and women for depression. However, the important thing for this pie chart is that actually most of the risk of depression is identified in the environment. About the brain, if you see a bear waving at you, then that may activate what's called the HP axis, your stress system, ending up with the production of cortisol, the stress hormone, which is getting you ready to basically fight or flight. It's distributing energy. In depression, there's evidence that people do have an overactive stress system, and that's in fact linked with stress hormones. Does it differ between men and women? Psychologists have a standard way of assessing stress. What they do is measure cortisol throughout this lovely procedure where a person coming to the lab has a rest. They're then introduced to this panel, and they're told they're going to have to basically have a job interview in front of this panel, an imaginary job interview. They're going to have to give a 5-minute speech of why they want this job. There's a psychologist, there's a camera, there's a recording, and they're going to be fed back about how they performed. The person then goes away to prepare the speech, and they give this speech for 5 minutes in front of this panel, who are very blank-faced and severe. And after that, in front of the panel for 5 minutes, they're asked to, as quickly as possible, count backwards in 13s from 1022. Any error, they start again. Are there any volunteers for this latter bit? I sat on this sort of panel. It's pretty bad for the panel stress, but it's bad for participants. These sorts of studies actually do identify differences in cortisol responses between men and women. The results are complex. The only thing that can be said with certainty is the results do differ. And one explanation is that both men and women use the fight and flight response, but women also tend to use what's called tend to befriend in situations of stress. They look after those around them and they seek social support to deal with stress, and that's linked with oxytocin. So there do look to be some differences in the brain level in terms of the stress reaction system. And let's go to 3 psychology processes that are important as well. One's called explanatory style. So you're fired from your job, but have you thought, why might that happen? You're fired from your job.
You're incompetent.
I'm sorry?
Incompetent.
You're incompetent, yes. What other reason might there be fired from your job? Sorry?
Stealing from the till.
Stealing from the till, okay. Sorry? There's a financial crisis, absolutely, yeah.
You're too competent and your boss steers you.
Brilliant, absolutely. Brilliant. And then we've got illustration of 3 important types of explanatory style. You've got blaming yourself, internalising problems. I'm incompetent. Stealing bits of ambiguous, but it's blaming yourself for it. Then you've got what's called an externalising attribution. That one example was the economy, and that's external situational blaming. And that's one type. And the other is external personalising, where you're blaming your boss because you're too good for them and a threat. Each of them has a psychological consequence. If you blame yourself for negative events, you feel bad about yourself. If you blame the external world, generally that's pretty healthy thing to do. If you're blaming your boss, borderline how that goes. That's so exponential. But women are more likely to blame themselves for ambiguous negative events than men. Another important aspect is worrying. Let's imagine I drop this bottle of water onto the floor, it crashes down there. Let's worry about that. What bad thing could happen now?
It could spill.
It could spill. What bad thing could happen if this spills?
There are electrical wires
There's electrical wires there. Yeah, what bad thing happened there? Die. Brilliant. Okay. That's the power of worry. Okay. From a benign event of dropping or putting a water bottle down there, I'm dead. Okay. Would you mind moving that water bottle? And there's lots of evidence that women worry more than men, and in fact that starts at an early age where they co-ruminate with their peers. And another important psychological concept is the self-concept, and there's lots of evidence that women generally have lower self-esteem than men, particularly about their interpersonal relationships, but also about body image, and that explains some of the differences in the rates of depression. It's not hard to see where those sorts of concerns about body image are coming from. Men seem less concerned about these issues. Let's go through this. Skip this. Do you think men or women have more stressful lives? Who thinks women have more stress in their lives? Oh, what's going on? On reflection. Okay, who thinks the rates between men and women are the same? To most people. I think men have more. Just a couple for that. Okay, so most people say equal levels of stress. Again, this Oxford survey, again, most people think that people's lives are equally stressful. Psychologists, we talk about life events. These are major events such as losing your job, breaking an important relationship, illness. And generally, these sorts of rates don't overall differ between men and women, that they're equal. So we don't necessarily have expression there, apart from one type. And that's what Rich has been talking about, sexual abuse, much higher than women and the men, and that definitely explains a proportion of the difference in the rates of depression. Not all of it, but a proportion, so that's clear. And interesting, it has, as Rich was hinting at, we talked about, it has knock-on effects on the biology, it affects your HPA access. So separating out the biology and the environment is very artificial. But if you remember anything from my talk, remember this. That actually what it probably is not on the great life events that causes, but the everyday stresses and strains. And there's lots of evidence from different sources that women are experiencing more day-to-day stresses than men. Give you an example from the workplace, just to think about body image and expectations of men and women. There's a very good longitudinal data, this is from a couple of years ago now, from several countries, showing that a woman whose average weight earns almost $400,000 less across a career than a woman who's 25 pounds below average weight. Men have the reverse relationship. So a man who is 25 pounds below average weight earns less than a man who is average weight. And there's a gradient. As men put on weight, they do better, up to obesity. So imagine the different pressures on men and women. Sorry? And there's, I don't know whether you've ever seen the Everyday Sexism Project, where people log the everyday instances of sexism in their lives. Extraordinary and depressing reading, but of just the stuff that goes on every day in people's lives and not talked about. And I don't know how many of you saw this, the Boots. This is a scientific company. Boys' toys, girls' toys. Boys' toys are science toys, girls' toys are pink toys. It's extraordinary. This was in The Guardian, and I was reading down the comments page, and someone helpfully pointed out a graphic that can tell you whether a toy is for a boy or a girl. So I'm going to share that with you now, because it's very useful if you're choosing toys. And of course, social factors, there is, I have to say, there's marriage, and marriage actually is protected for both genders. However, marriage protects men against depression, it doesn't protect women against depression. And much more briefly on alcohol problems, partly because there's much less on this. The heritability of alcohol problems is high, about 50 to 60%. There's no difference, there's no evidence of differences between the genders in genetic heritability of alcohol problems. But there is difference in physiology. If men and women drink the same amount of tequila, whatever they're drinking there, there'll be more alcohol in the woman's bloodstream. This is called alcohol sensitivity. That's protective against alcohol problems, because if you need less to have an effect, you don't need to drink so much. Impulsivity is important in alcohol problems, because if you can't resist having a drink, or more importantly, I think the second or third or fourth drink, then you'll more or less have a problem, and there's evidence that men have higher levels of risk-taking, sensation-seeking, and women have greater ability to restrain impulses, basically. So there's evidence there that fits. Oops. I'm going all in the wrong way now. Lastly, when we have stress in our lives, what we could all healthily do. Yep. Oh, that's 5. Sorry, I think I'm question. Okay. If a bad thing happened, of course, the sensible thing is to go and phone someone and share that stress with them, call them up, text them, all that sort of stuff. Or what most of us do is go and have a drink. And there's certainly evidence that actually both men and women drink more when they're having stress. There's some evidence that men tend to drink even more than women do at times of stress. But I think social factors here have a huge role as well. I think arguably one of the most powerful symbols of gender difference is alcohol. Real men drink. That's the message that the environment gives. And people are socialised at an early age. This is me and Richard there. A conference being initiated into the drinking. And things are changing, but just to give an examples to perhaps illustrate how they haven't changed hugely, isn't it amazing that even drinks are gendered, aren't they? And also, men and women are judged differently for getting drunk. So this is the Oxford survey again that I did. 10% thought men and women are judged equally if they get drunk, but actually most people think a woman is considered much worse than a man for getting drunk, and 5 people thought a man getting drunk is worse than a woman. Okay, so that's a very brief talk, I think, showing that there's factors at the brain level, the psychological and social level, why psychological problems may manifest differently between men and women, why men are perhaps more likely to internalise and men externalise other things such as alcohol. But what tips the balance? Why in the current environment do women suffer more? And I think it's in that clarification, it's the environment. The disorders where there's greater discrepancies are the one where you know the environment has the greater role. So I think it's probably in the everyday stresses and strains of women about the burdens of being carers, homemakers, often now earners, all whilst having less reward and control and respect in these tasks. All these tasks, and I think to look good whilst doing it as well. All of these have such an effect on your self-esteem. I think it's that, and the self-esteem is the sort of ultimate vulnerability factor for many mental health problems. I think it's those social practices that are sort of tipping the balance between men and women. So I think this received wisdom is wrong. I think when it comes to gender differences, that the important one is actually mental health that's been neglected. And I think men and women are very much from the same planet, but we're probably having different quality of air to breathe. So I'll stop there.
Okay, so thank you to all our speakers. Lubomira, are you... 30 minutes? Okay, that's good. So if you'd like to direct questions at the speakers, and I can...